I'm stuck with something, I try to make myself laugh. And if I can make myself laugh, then I'm like, okay, I'm having fun again. If I'm having fun, maybe the reader's having fun. So that's how humor's worked for me. It's been kind of like a writerly survival tool. I think if someone came down from on high and said you could no longer ever be humorous again in your writing, I don't think I could do it.
It is you. Oh yeah. It is you.
Hi everyone, Tim Schultz here. Hey, I hope you're doing well, and I want to thank you for listening to the Reading the Water podcast. As always, I appreciate you being here. Hey, I'm thrilled to welcome Dave Karczynski to the show. From winning the Traver Award in 2012 to the release of his latest book, Calling After Water, Dave's captivated readers with his ability to blend humor, introspection, and fishing tales into great stories. In this episode, we'll dig into Dave's new book, his philosophy on writing, and his thoughts on humor and fishing stories. We'll even discuss the proper way to spell musky. You know, Dave's a great writer, an even greater guy, and I'm excited to talk with him. So let's get him on the show. Well, Dave, great to have you here. How are you doing today?
Doing really good, Tim. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on the program. I am a big fan.
Oh, well, mutual. We've never met. This is our first time getting a chance to meet, but our paths have crossed a couple times. Let's see. You were planning a trip to the UP with Tom Hazelton in the mid 2000s, and he mentioned that you were coming, and we talked about the fact that you had won the Volcker Award in 2012. And I said, I bet he would like to go to Frenchman's Pond. And we got all that set up, and we were fishing on the Escanaba River, and something came up. I don't remember what it was, and you couldn't make that trip, or you couldn't make the front end of it anyway.
Yeah, I remember that as well. Wow, that is a while ago. 2012 is no longer just a couple years down the road. So I think it was coming out of a different trip, and that went over long, but for whatever reason, that didn't happen. But we came really close, and I regretted it ever since. Especially since I've seen and heard about your brook trout exploits.
I think that you, if I remember this right, you and Jason Tucker came up after I left, and you guys fished on the Escanaba for a day or two.
Right. And you know what? What I remember from that is wherever I was prior to that, I was using big rods because I had nothing lighter than a very fast 7-weight. So I remember going into my bag. So maybe I was smallmouth fishing somewhere in northeastern or northwestern Wisconsin, but went into my bag to get out my 5-weight, and all I had was my 7-weight Sage method. And I used that to fish dry flies rather unsuccessfully on those super technical Escanaba rainbows. But how cool that was.
So we came close. Now, the other place that you won't know about necessarily, and let's see, that the Volcker Award was for a hex story, if I remember right. Is that
indeed
correct?
Yes, that was for a hex story set in Wisconsin.
Okay. And you have a story in your new book, Calling After Water, and you have a hex story, and that hex story was originally published in Traverse magazine, I believe.
It was, yeah.
And you don't know this, but I submitted about that time, after you had, I submitted a story to them. I thought, that might be a neat place for this. It's called the Manistee River Waltz, and it's about hex fishing on the Manistee River. And they said, oh, we really like it, but we can't run it this year because Dave's got an article. And then you might remember the editor changed. She changed shortly after that. And I got back in touch with them, and they were catching up. And in the meantime, and so it turned out to be a good thing in a sense. I submitted that to Gray's, and it's going to be in the next fishing issue. So
you know what?
It all works out.
Not terrible at all.
Yeah. But that's the other. So now we get to meet.
Finally, the paths, the currents have converged.
That's right. So before we get into the book, I want to just talk about some themes that are bigger than the book that I love about the book. And let's just go. And I'm going to open the first one with a quote from Jimmy Buffett from his "You Had to Be There" live album. I had that thing memorized when I was when that came out. And in between songs, I think he's introducing the song "Miss You So Badly." He says, "Tragedies very often become comedies, and they better become comedies real quick, or else you're in a lot of trouble." I love the way you use humor in your writing. So let me ask you about that yourself, but then from a perspective of a professor, in the broad sense, what's the role of humor in fishing writing? And then I guess I'll follow that up with, is forced humor worse than no humor sometimes?
Ooh, geez.
But let's go back. What do you think about humor in writing? You clearly do it well.
Yeah. Well, I do it partly because, and I was talking about this with a student recently who was in the middle draft of an essay, but I use humor to make the writing process more endurable for myself. So when I first start writing a draft, it's actually usually pretty grave and humorless. Like that's how the ideas first generate. And then I'll look at the page and I'll say, well, I want to go forward with this idea, but I'm not in any way, shape, or form amused, by what's happening on the page here. So I need to make myself laugh. I need to start having fun with it. So for me, it's an essential part of writing because it's what makes the medicine go down. I mean, different people. I love having writing. It can be a hard thing to do. Maybe it's a hard thing to start, but starting with a joke has always helped me in that writing process. So,
Mhm, mhm.
and when I'm stuck with something, I try to make myself laugh. And if I can make myself laugh, then I'm like, okay, I'm having fun again. If I'm having fun, maybe the reader's having fun. So that's how humor's worked for me. It's been kind of like a writerly survival tool. I think if someone came down from on high and said you could no longer ever be humorous again in your writing, I don't think I could do it. And
Mhm.
I have tried to write more serious essays that do not deploy humor whatsoever, but they just don't work for me. I'll get a couple pages in and then like I can't see myself there anymore. It doesn't feel like me. And then once the jokes get rolling, it lubricates. I think humor lubricates, for me at least, a big important part of the generative process.
Yeah, yeah. It's tricky. You're a professor, I'm a professor, and I've never been very comfortable telling jokes in class. The fear of the bomb is so tough, and you don't have to see it when you bomb in writing, but it still is a bad thing. So it's do you ever worry about it? Do you worry like,
Well,
oh, I don't know if I should do
I
this?
was a very confident jokester in the early tenure of my teaching career. So I started teaching here at U of M when I was 25. I'm 44 now. So those first 8 years, the jokes were hitting, they were going good, and then I hit my early 30s, and like those classroom jokes, like you said, like they stopped working. So
Yeah.
um, I don't specifically or deliberately deploy humor. As part of my professorial shtick so much anymore. I'm still
Yeah.
happy with the way it plays on the page, but I think fly anglers, we all have a shared reference point, right? It's fish, it's water, it's the sport, and you need something of a shared reference point for humor to work. And now that I've got at least 20 years on a lot of my students, that shared reference point that makes humor work isn't quite there. Now, if I had a class of fly anglers,
Yeah.
I would let the jokes roll. But yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that shared reference point is really important. So I don't use humor all the time, but whenever I can, it's a very useful tool.
Yeah, yeah. A close relative to humor is self-deprecation, and that you have that, and that's the one. I guess when I always feel you got to be careful on that. Uh, that's when I think that can if when it's forced, it can come off wrong, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, and I'm with you on the forced humor. If you are given an assignment and that assignment is be funny starting now, it's probably not going to be successful. But the self-deprecation, I happen to have, in my fishing life, I have many opportunities to laugh at myself. So maybe that's part of it. I don't necessarily feel like I'm manufacturing it. Um, uh, I've had, many times where you can shake your head and say, "Oh, how did I get into this situation?" And it's just kind of laughing your way out of it, laughing as a, perspective, kind of affirming gesture. Life isn't all bad. Sometimes um, we, we have to laugh at ourselves. I think that's the important thing. And I enjoy laughing at myself. So maybe that's
Uh,
what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Well, oh, no, and you do it very natural. I think that's the key. It needs to come out naturally. I've brought this up before. Norm Macdonald,
Yeah.
the comedian, he, and I thought this was just great, and it goes outside of comedy. He said that as a comedian, you want to get laughter, not applause. That applause is something that you can force a crowd to do, but they want it, right? They want that, but when you make them laugh, you got them, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's the key. That they don't want, you don't want to see it coming and have it be kind of gratuitous. It's yeah,
Sure. I like that distinction too, because we make a decision to applaud, right? We can decide
yeah,
applaud
yeah,
or not applaud. But laughter should be this irrepressible force, right? Like, I
yeah,
have to
yeah,
laugh. Like, I'm not choosing to laugh. I have no choice but to laugh. So I think humor works, in that sense, as well. But, as a writer, you don't often get a chance to see how things are coming off on the page, right?
yeah.
You're very, very rarely, if not ever, in the same room as, someone reading one of your books, chuckling or not chuckling, applauding or not
Mhm.
applauding, right? So
Yeah, and so it feels so good when someone sends you a note, doesn't it? And they
it,
tell you they
it
get
really
it. They
does.
get
You're
your,
like, wow, there's evidence that these words were read, and that the
yeah,
reception was positive, and that furthermore, someone felt compelled to take the next step and reach out. So,
yeah.
people listening at home, if you read something that you like by any writer, you would make their day by reaching out.
That is true. No question about it. Another theme that shows up in your book is you have a dozen references, roughly, to Musky. And I've become kind of a Musky nut, but I'm going to have to ask you, uh, in every one of those references, you misspell it with the IE instead of the properly Chicago Manual of Style Y. And I want to know, I want you to explain this. I
You
just
know,
returned from Musky Madness with Bob White. He spells it with a Y.
And I was tearing myself over this, like, for real. It was a question that we had with the copy editors of the book, and we could have gone in either direction. And at this time, I was being a little bit difficult with the way I wanted things kind of set from a stylistic point of view. So I went with Muskie. It's been the spelling I've worked with a couple of different magazines. Though I grew up Musky, right? So that
Yeah,
was
yeah.
that's what the fish is called to me. And when I hit send to the copy editor, announcing that I wanted to go IE, I immediately regretted it. And if I hadn't been going back and forth so much with them that week and being so difficult, I would have sent a follow-up email and say, just kidding, let's do Y. So I
Uh,
sent it, and then I'm like, it was like, you know, swallowing a pepper. It burned for a couple of hours, and then I got over it. But yeah, if I
oh,
ever do another one, I'll probably have to go, to the Muskie of my youth, Musky. But interesting. I didn't realize that I mentioned muskies that many times, because I think there's only one piece where I'm actually muskie fishing.
yeah. Yeah,
So
it might be in it
clearly,
all there.
clearly, I do have muskies on the brain, more often than not, and I think it shows that even when I'm writing about other fish, the muskie is there.
Yeah. I thought this was going to be a throwaway kind of comment, but now I didn't realize
Oh
this
no,
was
no,
an
you
issue for
do
you.
now, and that pepper, that indigestion, that heartburn is back. It'll be evening before this one subsides.
I think not only do muskie love the way they torment us when we're fishing for them, when we're thinking about fishing for them, when people are spending an hour tying flies that they'll never catch one of them with.
Just one fly
Now they
for
can
that hour,
add
just one.
they can add to their list of ways they torment us. We get indigestion over how to spell their name.
Right. I think the fear is the muskie gods are listening, and if I've chosen the wrong spelling, they're going to wreak havoc on the rest of my muskie career.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so this is a musky, very much a musky time of year. I unfortunately don't have any musky trips planned for this
Oh,
year, but a large portion of my brain is just thinking about muskies constantly right now.
so you could do me a favor. I will ask this. Um, so muskie, you go muskie fishing.
Hmm.
You cast a rod in the most what I consider unconventional way with this giant fly soaking up water, and you're flinging it with the Belgian cast, and you do that, and your hope is, oh my gosh, I think we got to follow, and you get
Yeah.
excited about that, and if you're lucky, you're going to catch a fish at some point, and when you catch that fish, it's about a 2-minute fight. It's
Yeah.
not like you're going through an epic battle. You'll hold tight. If you got a guide with you, they'll say, "Do not let that fish go," and they'll scoop it up, and that'll be that. So, so I don't have to spend whatever it is, $500 an hour with a
Mm.
therapist. Can you explain to me why we like to do this?
The allure of the muskie. I feel like, you know, it's this archetypal monster. It's big with a broad shovel head. It has, 1,000 teeth. We don't catch them perhaps that big, but we know that they can grow very large. So I think it's like what the muskie represents. The muskie represents in freshwater fishing, and I'm not thinking about like giant king salmon, but I think a pinnacle predator. So I think maybe there's this kind of metaphysical idea of pinnacle predator against pinnacle predator, especially if we're in you know the the Midwest Northwoods where it is the pinnacle predator. Um, and I think it's just this sense of a meeting of not equals, but close to equals. Whereas, a, I can catch a 14-inch, brown trout and it's delightful. Um, but I'm never afraid of it at any point. I think there's a part in the act of catching a muskie where there's fear at some point, and I think that's maybe what we like about it. We are under attack. Like this big thing has attacked us. We've invested maybe so much time into the building of this fly, an hour, two if you're slow,
Yeah.
that like we've put something of ourselves into this fly. So when that foot long, hour long creation gets attacked, maybe we too are under attack. Maybe it's for that thrill. I think that's what I like about musky fishing. For me, it's that initial attack and that initial hook set in those first few seconds of the fight. That's what's really exciting for me, and also that's what's so painful. Like when I think about like painful fish that I have lost, I think most of the spots in the top 10 are muskies. Once I yelled in anguish so hard I saw stars fishing, and that was musky fishing. And so it hurts to not stick a muskie, a good fish, and and it hurts to miss other fish too. But there's something that smarts all the more stridently about missing a good muskie eat.
Yeah, I have a memory burned into my. It's one of the top fish memories I have, and it's this muskie launched straight up at the end of the boat, and my fly next to its head out of its mouth at that point. But I was fishing recently, and we had guides, and so if I catch a muskie, someone's gonna net it for me and take care of it. And on my way driving back, I was in Wisconsin driving to the UP. Someone said, "Stop here." They told me a very specific place. They said, "I promise you will
Mm.
probably catch a muskie."
Ooh,
And
I
uh,
like that.
and I thought about it, And I said, well, what will I do if I catch it? I don't know what to do with it once I get it. And they said, well, just get yourself some big needle nose pliers and, you grab it. And it turns out I didn't go. Something happened. I had to get back home. But yeah, that's the point is like, once you have them, you got to land those fish
Sure, and you need all kinds of tools to land it. And my musky net, it's a telescoping and foldable net.
yeah,
And when
yeah.
it's unfolded, I can stand into it and it's up to here. So I think the very fact that we're fishing from a boat in which resides this net, which will swallow us whole, I think that
Yeah.
kind of helps to kind of shape the mythos of the muskie, right? Like it is bigger. We use
Yeah.
different tools. We don't necessarily go even, pike fishing with a net that comes up to here if you're standing in it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, just thinking, it is amazing. You have a net that if one of your buddies falls out of the boat, you could scoop them up with that net.
You could scoop
And
them up. If you didn't mind close quarters, two people could have lunch very amicably in that net. That net will last a long time. You've got to practice with it. Whenever I'm fishing with someone new, I say, "All right, here's where it's stowed. Get the net. Get it ready, get it set, because and do it calmly. What is it? Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast, right? So to get that net even out within 30 seconds to a minute, you got to practice it. So not a lot of different fishing enterprises require that the net person get a couple
yeah,
reps in preparation for
right.
the big event. But
Practice.
yeah, and you're not too far from some pretty decent musky fishing. Even the
Hmm.
rivers to the east and west of the Bad are not too far from you.
Yeah, no, I keep intending to go more than
Mhm.
just. I've been going on a trip a year with a lot of people who know what they're doing, so I'm not alone. But the whole point was to get to the point I can start fishing for them more frequently,
Sure, yeah.
close to
Yeah,
home.
that's the goal of many of us, but it's a hard fish to pursue solo just because
Yeah.
yeah, the whole landing. And then wow, how are you gonna get your photo of that 52-inch muskie that you just planted, right? Probably not
Right.
gonna happen.
Right. Hey. Other thing, speaking of buddies in the boat with you, that I love is how much you talk about people in your book. And here's a broad question: what makes a good fishing buddy?
Oh, what makes a good fishing buddy? Well, I think what makes a good fishing buddy is uh, and they need to be equally skilled at uh, enduring quiet moments, long quiet moments, fishing or prepping food or setting up camp, and then really well versed in kind of like the convivial moments. So I think a good fishing buddy can do the silence really really well, and then can do the laughter really really well. And I think you put those two things together, you've got the makings of a fun trip.
Yeah.
And they should be really good with a musky net. Really good with it.
Yeah.
What, what
What
do you what do you think on that one?
I I think I would echo what you say. Uh, how did I put it? I once put it that their memory is short enough to forget all the jokes you've told them and long enough to remember the ones they've said.
And you
uh,
bring up a good point there, because once you have like really good fishing buddies and you've got 10, 15 years of fishing under your respective belts,
yeah.
you can hear in your head like, oh, I've told this one before, or you were there, weren't you? Right.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, so I
Right.
think they're all good listeners too.
Yeah. And on that, and this is a hard question because they're just so different. What's your feeling about fishing alone versus fishing with someone? And does it matter on the species? Are there some species you just soon fish alone? Are there others that you like to have a buddy with you or two?
Sure. Yeah, great question. They're very different experiences, fishing with people, without people. I love to fish with buddies. Musky fishing, I don't think I've ever gone, solo. So that's something I always think, about in terms of a social event. Um, Trout fishing is one where I think they're both really interesting, rich experiences, whether you're fishing with friends or not. I definitely, uh, I love fishing solo evening spinner falls or evening hatches
Hmm.
or hatch matching situations. Like I think that as a type of fishing is really companionable to the solo angler. You just have so much to think about and so much to process and so many moves to make and so much focus
Hmm.
asked of you that I think that lends itself to solo fishing. So yeah, so I do like doing both. And you know, when I first started fishing, I'm sorry, I've been fishing since I was 2 or 3. But when I first started fly fishing in my mid 20s, I couldn't find anyone to fish with. And then I got into my 30s, and then like I couldn't find anyone not to fish with.
Hmm.
And so now I'm in a situation where I kind of have a little bit of both. So it's more balanced, some solo stuff and um, some crew stuff.
When you're on foot and you fish with someone, do you typically separate and fish, or do you often fish side by side, wade in the river?
Yeah, so if it's a small stream and we're moving upstream, we'll either, trade rising fish or if we're prospecting kind of like trade pools or trade spots. And then but for the most part when I'm fishing with friends, we're often in trout country on bigger water. And so we trade off on rising fish.
Hmm.
Or if, someone has gotten 2 12-inch fish in a row, or trade off on rising fish unless someone catches a giant, right? Then everything goes out
Yeah.
the window. You catch a behemoth, and you have to let someone catch a couple just to catch up to that inch total. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I think we tend to do it. And then if I'm from a boat and we're streamer fishing, we just have a rotation, like a volleyball game.
Yeah.
Front of the boat becomes rower, rower goes to the back of the boat, and we kind of keep that cycle going, more or less on hour intervals. Of course, if it's your boat, and it's often my boat, you have a way of, oh, look, it's prime time, and I guess I manage the clock, so I'm at the front of the boat.
Yeah.
So all who fish with me, I don't actually do that. It's all coincidental.
It just works out that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. What how about place? You write a lot about places. What this is a broad question, maybe it's even not answerable. What makes a good fishing destination?
I love the unanswerable questions, but for me, like a good fishing destination has kind of it's out there, for me, right? So I don't like fishing in people's backyards. I live in downstate Michigan, and there's some great opportunity here, but I'd be more inclined to kind of like save my fishing days and get to someplace a little bit more far flung. So I like getting away from, the trappings of civilization. Um, uh, I like, fishing destinations. Like if it's in a Bermuda Triangle, far from hotels and gas stations, that's really good because hotels and gas stations tend to kind of congregate anglers. So the places that I kind of fish on the regular, I think if you were to kind of put them in a spreadsheet, you'd be surprised. Like, oh wow, they are all as far as you can be, from a gas station or a hotel. And I know Airbnb kind of complicates things to that end.
Hmm.
But yeah, I like I like wilder places. And I think that's the only thing. Like it's not so much the species, it's the kind of the wildness of the place, or how far removed it is from, the trappings of everyday life. So to that end, it could be a bluegill. Like if there's like,
Hmm.
there's some great pothole lakes up in the central UP that I would love to go fish.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that um, yeah, I think that is like the first, second, and third thing that makes for a good fishing location. And then if the fishing is good, great. But I think I'd rather have, kind of tough fishing in a beautiful and wild place than great fishing and kind of, the periphery of, the city or the suburb or what have you.
Yeah. What do you look like on a global sense? Like you've been all
Mm.
over the world, and what are you looking for there? I feel like what kind of trip would somebody uh, uh, throw at you that you would say, I got to do this?
BC Steelhead. I'm
Uh
ready
huh.
to go. My bags can be packed in an hour. So if anyone if anyone desperately needs a writer to cover BC Steelhead, um, I can clear a
You're the
weekend.
guy, huh?
Yeah. So yeah, that holds a lot of allure, and I think about that from time to time. Right, where would I really want to go? What places would I go back to? But for sure, BC Steelhead, I would love to do. So it's not about numbers. Like I'd be happy to go and catch one fish, two would be great. But just to be in that space and have an encounter with a large wild thing, that would be pretty cool.
Hmm. Hmm. I want to talk about your writing, your career, your trajectory as a writer. And when I learned a little more about you through your book that you started out writing fiction, it reminded me of an interview I saw many years ago. So here comes another reference to John Volker. And his quote was something along the line. He said, "You know, some of my critics say my fishing stories are some of my best fiction." so, anyway, tell let's talk a little bit about your evolution. You started writing fiction. You
Right.
found the spark with fishing, and then maybe do you see yourself ever writing fiction again? But tell about
Yeah.
that
No,
trajectory.
that's a great question. The fishing writer who's suddenly identified as a former fiction writer feels compelled to affirm that everything that I write about did actually happen. Um, but yeah, so growing up, I had a knack for writing, and I liked doing it. And the essay as a form, like, wasn't really a thing. So when I was in college, you studied fiction and poetry, narrative nonfiction or narrative. Uh, the essay as a genre wasn't really kind of bandied about very much. So I never really thought too much about it. The cool thing to be was to be a famous novelist, right? So like, um, I first wanted my early childhood professional goals were first to have my own fishing show, then to be a professional baseball player, then to be a professional guitarist, and fourth was writer, right? Um, so yeah, uh, so I read, fiction, and that's what I went to graduate school for. And the change to writing essays and writing about fish was kind of one of like writerly survival. I was just really burnt out on fiction writing, and I realized that, you know, I just kind of lost my passion for it after graduate school, and I was fishing at the same time. Um, and so I was trying to write fiction, and it wasn't working, and I was fishing all the time, and the fishing time was cutting into the writing time, and the kind of crisis in question that I reference in the forward of the book, I'd won a substantial sum of money to finish a novel, and I just wanted nothing to do with the novel, and I wanted everything to do with the river. So I had this, constant sense of guilt that I wasn't working on the novel, and I couldn't stay away from the water. A friend of mine suggested writing about, what I was doing, fishing,
Hmm.
and it seemed like a bizarre idea. The writing world and the fishing world, they were two big parts of my life, but they never met. So I thought, well, let's see what happens. And I loved writing about being on the water. I loved writing about rivers and fish and the natural world. Um, I love that through fishing writing, you can write about joy and ecstatic experiences. And at least when I was in graduate school, um, you know, a lot of the narratives that had a lot of currency were a little bit, sorrowful, inward looking. It wasn't a place to explore the subjects of joy and ecstasy. And life is relatively short. If we're going to spend time, putting words on the page, why not make ourselves laugh, write about joyful things,
Mhm.
and celebrate that part of the world. So it it was fun to write about. And then after a couple of years of fishing writing, I realized that it could be a ticket to having certain travel experiences, say.
Mhm. Mhm.
So did not have money to exchange for fishing travel, but I had words that I could give, and it was a currency that worked for a while. So that wasn't the plan. It just became like this happy byproduct of writing about fishing, that I got to go to some cool places and kind of pay for those experiences with words, which
Mhm.
I have in abundance, and wish I had other things in
Mhm.
similar abundance, but don't we all?
Yeah. Any of your fiction anywhere that people can read it? Did anything
No, I
ever make
mean,
it
well,
to,
you know what? The answer is yes. If you were to go to, used bookstores in the rural Midwest, you might find an issue of the Nebraska Review from 2001, and there you'd find a short story, actually, written about a place I used to fish as a kid. But no, so I got out of the fiction game before I really started publishing anything there. I do from time to time think about it, but if I sit down in front of the computer, there's just too many thoughts and experiences that I've had on the water that
yeah.
I'm chomping at the bit to explore. So, you got to play the hot hand. It's football season, right? And for me, the hot hand is always, some fishing stories. I've always got this little narrative inside of me saying, "Put me in, coach." And like he wants to play, put him in. Just so happens to be a fishing tale.
Yeah. How about you could do, True Love and the Adams or, uh
Yeah, I mean, there's so much opportunity, right? Within that. And I talk about this more regularly now because my wife is a huge reader of fiction,
uh,
and she just cranks through these fantasy novels, and I'm like, wow, geez, people are really eating that stuff up. Like, how could I write one of those, right? It would have to, but then whenever I think about writing a fantasy novel, well, it's set, in some fictional realm thousands of years ago, but it's on the water. Our protagonist is probably going to be an angler, so we'll see. If you ever see fishing fantasy written under a pseudonym that sounds a little like my name, that's probably me.
and if you want a fishing fantasy story that's fiction, it has to involve a muskie.
It has to, right? It will, a muskie or some kind of similar fish. Maybe it's purple. It's got a slightly different name. Yeah, there's those
Yeah.
the tropes that we'll have to play with. But yeah, so if you see that book out, I'll just say it wasn't me.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got this evolution from fiction to fishing, more or less true. They're all
More, I
uh,
mean,
more.
yeah, I think the where the where the fiction comes into it. If you write fiction, you've got to write scenes, right? So
Right,
I think
right, right.
I try to write some scenes here and there, but yeah, just about. Just there are very few stretchers. I mean, we all tell some stretchers, right?
Yeah.
We're anglers after
When
all.
when people when people ask me if it's true, if you write something, the fishing story, I say, all I can tell you is exactly how I remember it. Uh,
Right. So you
that's
have
it.
complete 100% fidelity to your memory of the experience, and
Yep,
in this
yep.
sense, no anglers are liars at all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't, we're now, okay, we're going to talk about John Volker one more time. I know a few of his stories. The Intruder, for instance, were based, he brought two different ideas together. They were all true, they all happened, but
Yeah.
not the way he tells the story. And I think that's okay. I think uh, we could go on for a long time on this topic. Maybe I will. They got a guy that teaches writing. um, uh, what does it mean to write Hemingway's true sentence?
Right.
Because I think when you tell in a fishing story, you can, yeah, yeah, some things can be a little off than the way they happen, because I don't think the fish you caught, the way you caught it, that's not the truth in the story. There's a different thread that has to be true, but that may have nothing to do, that doesn't have anything to do with the size of the fish or the
Sure, yeah.
tippet size, anything like that. What does that mean to you? Would it say write one true sentence?
Yeah, I think I think whether or not a sentence is true, and when Hemingway said that, I think he was talking about, the writer's apprehension of the truth of the sentence, because ultimately only you know if that's like a true sentiment, and that
Yeah.
there's nothing embellished, and not even embellished, but there's nothing kind of false or construed about it. So, uh, yeah, and that's something that's it's a great question, and I think that's more of like a writer's relationship to their own work. Like, am
Mhm.
I kind of representing myself accurately here? Am I changing or misrepresenting a sentiment for some, dubious reason to appear a certain way? Am I posturing? So I think for the angler, maybe
Mhm.
that's where kind of this idea of Hemingway's truth might have some purchase. Am I posturing in some way? Am I Do I have fidelity to my memory of the experience, or am I changing my memory of the experience
Mhm.
for some reason? But it's a great question, and
Yeah.
I think looking at individual sentences, which is something I only started to do after I wrote the book, but you look for individual sentences that you might be able to use for some marketing
Mhm.
purpose, or a quote to throw on social. And I found that once you start looking at just individual sentences, taken out of the context of the story, they become really interesting things to look at and play with and tinker with in their own respect. And, I had to stop doing it, because every time I would take a sentence out of the book and I would just be looking at that sentence for an hour, I would be like, well, actually, this is a little bit wrong. And actually, this should be, and I would want to rework every one. So a part of me was wanted to take each individual sentence. I mean, this is ridiculous and
Mhm.
absurd if we had infinite lifetimes, but how many sentences are in this book? Let's see, there's 200 pages. Let's say there's a math guy, right?
Yeah.
Let's say there's a couple 100,000 sentences or tens of thousands of sentences. If you could spend a day with each one of those sentences, that would, you'd write one book in your entire life, but it would be interesting. And um,
Mhm.
yeah, so I think his focus on the sentence as a unit of meaning is really interesting, and I think there's, great merit in just looking at like the individual sentence, not as part of a paragraph, as part of a larger story. It's just a luxury, that's hard to afford.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I think if you stare at one of your own sentences all week long and you don't want to change it, it's true. But if you stare at one of your sentences all week long and you want to make some changes to it, it probably suggests that you're still aspiring to a greater truth. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe that.
That's great. You your writing has a beautiful rhythm to it. Does that come naturally to you, or do you work hard to capture the rhythm, the flow of your writing?
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that. I work hard at it, and um, yeah, I do work hard at it. Certain things kind of come out. Actually, I think when you work too hard at it, you mess up the rhythm. So
Mhm.
I learned a lot kind of like working on this book. And interestingly, when I first got the book under contract, my initial thought was, okay, I'm going to go back and really trick out every one of these essays. I'm going to really just like spruce them up, right? Going to like put shellac in their hair and shine their shoes and trot them out on the stage. And I was two or three essays in when I realized that I was just making them bad. I was making them terrible. They were just losing everything. And so I think that you can overdo it. So I do work hard at it, but I think, with the rhythm, uh, I think the brain gets most of it right when it first comes out, and maybe then there's some kind of tweaks you can do. Um, but I do work hard at it. I might have worked too hard at it from time to time, in that. moving a comma. There's, I think, an Oscar Wilde quote that says, you're done with an essay when you have, just put the commas back in that you took out yesterday. So there's a lot of that. But yeah, so I do work hard at it, but I think I could work even less hard, and because I think there's a point at which it becomes a diminishing return, right?
Yeah.
And I think, yeah.
Another Michigan writer, Elmore Leonard.
Oh yeah,
His Elmore Leonard's rules on writing, and one of them, my memory of it, paraphrase it, is if it sounds like writing, rewrite it.
yeah.
Uh,
No,
right?
that is, yeah, that is true. Yeah, if it sounds like you're trying, you're trying.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, one of the best compliments I ever get is and if someone says, and it usually would happen if they know me in some capacity and they
Mhm.
read something I write and they'll say, "I heard your voice. That
Yeah.
sounded like you talking." And as long as it's not as crazy as I talk when I'm just talking, but it still looks like I honor the craft, I really appreciate that when that happens.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful thing because we all have our own personal dialects, right? And when we can nail
Yeah.
that on the page, we're just being ourselves, but it's also that thing that makes us different. So
Yeah,
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 voice is that kind of it's hard to work on, and I work with a lot of younger writers at the university, so it takes some time and some work to sound like yourself, as paradoxical as that sounds, right?
yeah.
So when you can sound like yourself on the page without too much effort, you've got it made.
How when you work with young writers, how important do you think having them read their writing out loud is for capturing that type of thing?
I think it's hugely important. And if I think the at-home listener can even try this with their own emails, right? Like or a
Yeah.
text message, the last thing you've written. Like, you're going to hear different things when you read it out loud. You're going to see different opportunities that maybe weren't there. The language talks back to you, I think, in a different way when you read out loud. And that's a big thing I talk about with my own students. Like, if you listen to the words that you wrote on the page, they're going to talk back to you a little bit. They're going to give you hints and suggestions about what they could do. Like, oh, let's
Mhm.
try this, let's try that. And you get a little bit of that when you just read your own words on the page, but when you read them out loud, I think they can they can suggest directions, or words can kind of help us write. You've
Uh-huh.
got to get words on the page first, right? And that's another you know reason to always get started. Once you've got a couple words on the page, they can start whispering suggestions to you.
Yeah, yeah. Um, let's talk about, so I'm kind of looking at three aspects of your life that all come together, and your evolution as an angler from going from a gear angler, as we call them, to flies, and you wrote a book about that, about
Yeah,
from lure to fly, to help people do that. How did that happen? And have you? How often do you have relapses and say, I'm going
right.
to use some gear?
Well, you know what? A monster relapse is coming, and and Tom Bai is going to start charging me more for the drag, because my 2-year-old next year is going to be a 3-year-old, which means it's time. It's
Yeah,
time for the Zebco, the kid Zebco. So next year is going to be bobbers and night crawlers, and I'm actually really looking forward to it.
yeah,
And I don't have to apologize for that, because it's permitted, right?
yeah.
But yeah, I grew up gear fishing. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, where I don't think I saw a fly rod until I was in my 20s. I mean, I saw them on the 2 hours of fishing shows that we would watch religiously every Saturday afternoon, but never saw one in real life. But my brother and I, my two brothers and I, we were fanatical anglers. So we started using bait casters at the age of 10. So we could you know control it. We could slip down a river following a bottom contour, jig rods in each hand. I mean, we fished
Hmm.
a lot. We made our own catfish baits. We fished whenever we could. But then I think I got into, I was in my early 20s, and I can't recall exactly what it was that made me want to grab a fly rod. I was going to college at a small, college in Western Illinois, and they had a university owned, you know, series of ponds well away from campus. So you could only fish there if you were faculty or student. It being a small liberal arts school, almost nobody fished. So I had it to myself. And I mean, the bass were just incredible. Um, but it was there that I first kind of, cast a fly rod. And, when I first got a fly rod, there was no kind of internet um, or I had no access to instruction. I got a 7-weight Cortland kit combo with a hair bug. So imagine like
Mhm.
your first, encounter casting a fly rod is a 7-weight, and you're trying to cast this, ultra air resistant, big old hair bug, right? So the casting was terrible, atrocious. I didn't know how anybody could possibly do it. And I don't know if I would have persisted with it that long if the catching of the fish wasn't so exhilarating. Because I remember that first, it was a largemouth bass. This is my first fish on a fly rod. And, I was just, um, I managed to get the hair bug out 12 feet, which was, a far cast for me at the time. And a very generous largemouth just, ate it. And it was just such an amazing fight on that fly rod. So that's like it was like that the tactile sensation of fighting a fish on a fly rod that did it for me. So it could have just been a one-off, right? Like, oh, I caught a fish on a fly rod, I'll never touch it again. But I think I was curious about it, but it was just, how much fun it was to catch a fish on a fly rod. I think that's what really made it easier for me to, um, you know, devote more and more of my fishing energies toward fly fishing.
Mhm.
It was just so cool. I just never felt anything quite like that. Yeah. So, have you? What's your fishing history like? Did you do a lot of gear fishing prior to fly fishing?
Oh yeah, yeah. And my I didn't seriously fly fish till I moved to the Upper Peninsula, which was like 32 years ago. And
Mhm.
I had fly fished as a kid. I'd somebody gave me a fly rod. It was the husband of my mom's hairdresser, and he'd always give me stuff that he felt sorry for me. And he, I remember I could catch bluegill with it, and the statute of limitations is out. So I can tell you, I would catch bluegill with that on little popping bugs, and I would clean them in the John boat. And then I had a rig that I was expert at catching channel cat in this lake,
Oh
and I
yeah,
would catch them with fillets from bluegill. So that's my roots right there.
sure. Hey,
Um,
nothing wrong with catfishing.
And my first is similar. I mean, not the same, but similar. My first fly rod was a Cortland kit. It was a 5/6 weight rod. Unfinished. You could see the wrappings
Hmm.
on the graphite. And I caught at my wife's family's pond. I was casting like cast as far as I could get them out there. I remember it was a little spider, little rubber spider, and catching bluegill, and a largemouth took it,
Mm.
and I broke off. But until it broke off, that feeling, I thought, this is the way to catch fish. This is what you do. This is so much better for me. And yeah, a lot of relapses, but now I don't think I've used spinning gear. I can't remember the last time I used spinning gear. It's
Yeah, I think the last time, I mean, I think walleye fishing I've done a little bit, and again, talk to me in a year's time. I should have, 40 fish fries under my belt by September 2025. You know, but I think it sells itself. Listen, this is a note to Cortland: get more kit combos out, just airdrop them across the country, and you'll grow up
yeah,
more fly anglers. Um,
yeah,
but yeah, it sells itself. Like catch one good fish on a fly rod, and I feel like
yeah,
the enterprise sells itself.
yeah. And I just want to be clear. I don't fish with a fly rod instead of the spinning gear because I think there's something fundamentally wrong with spinning gear. In fact, I remember we were in, I don't know where we were, my wife and I went into one of these big sporting goods stores. She was looking for something, and there were three things that I just loved doing. I found a basketball. I haven't played basketball in years, and I dribbled a basketball in that store. And I thought, oh my God, the memories are coming back. I went into the baseball section and put on a glove, and
Mhm.
and boy, the modern gloves are really nice. And but that I thought, oh man, what? How much fun did I have playing baseball? Never thought I'd be a professional like you did, but
Oh, yeah.
uh, but the other one, I went into the section with all of the spinning gear,
Mhm.
and I looked at the rods, and I looked at the lures, the soft baits, the hard bait, everything, and uh, that it brought back memories. And I was thinking, you know what? Maybe I should get some spinning gear and go spin fishing, just to bring back a little bit of the youth. It's so I get no problem with it. I just prefer when I have a chance to fish. I like to fish fly rod.
Sure, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think a big part of the allure of fly fishing too is you could have fun just casting. You could go to an Olympic-sized swimming pool and you could have a pleasant, hour just casting, right? Working on your casts. I don't think the
yeah,
same could necessarily be said. Um, so I think that, and I nothing against spinning and bait casting. And like I said, there's going to be a lot of bobbers in my future.
yeah,
But I think so much of the pleasure in fly fishing is in the casting. I started dry fly fishing way too early, for Michigan. And I do it because it's just fun to, cast a floating line in a dry fly and imagine how that thing's going to get crushed in a month's time, when the water's not 45 degrees. But
yeah.
yeah, so there's just it's so much fun
Yeah.
to cast,
And go back to the bobbers. The
Yeah.
one of the big influences on me early on in my development of fly fishing was a videotape by Mel Krieger called Beginnings,
Hmm.
and it is spectacular. It is unbelievable. This guy's one of the he would be an I would love to have him teach a university course. Someone that teaches the way he taught
Hmm.
fishing and casting. But when he was talking about indicator fishing, he made a reference to just bobbers in general. And he said, there's an old saying, and I use it all the time. There's nothing as beautiful as the place in the water where the bobber used to be.
Oh, oh, I love that.
Isn't that great? Isn't that great?
I'm writing that down because,
Yeah,
in addition to there being bobber fishing in my imminent future, there might be fishing writing also in the not too distant future, and it that might be a great quote to begin,
yeah, yeah.
a heretical bobber fishing essay.
Yep. What so you talked earlier about how good it feels when someone writes to you or calls you, whatever, and tells you how much they enjoyed your books in some way. Have you gotten people uh, regarding your From Lure to Fly book tell you that they did it, they made the move, and your book helped them get to fly fishing?
Yeah, so that book, I definitely got people who they wrote to me like middle of the book, like really excited, really found it useful. But I haven't heard from anyone like maybe I could follow up with some of those people.
Yeah.
The focus group 5 years on, what degree are they, fishing with a fly rod? How did it work? Yeah, I heard a lot about people reading the book and being really excited. And I think, we're coming upon the reading season, right?
Yeah, yeah.
This is when we're going to kind of stash the rods for a while and do some of that reading. So uh, I was getting a lot of messages, people, scheming, and planning in the winter months. So
Mhm.
I hope that a couple people found the sport of fly fishing a little less intimidating,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I certainly found it really intimidating because, all the line, what's tippet, leader, yeah, it was, I had to unlearn so many things, and it was, I think, harder than starting fresh. So the reason I wrote that book, was to kind of speak directly to the person who had a competence and a base understanding so they wouldn't get more confused than they needed to be,
Mhm.
in the transition to playing with the fly rod.
Yeah, that's great. That is, you know, I don't know how many years ago. It was shortly after I moved to the UP. We would take the kids and go to Green Bay area
Mm,
and stay down there. It was a way to get away, get out of Houghton, and go. And I remember I looked for fly shops in the area,
yeah,
and I found this fly shop called Tight Lines. And I went to it, and it was in their original location. They were in the downtown kind of area of the, I forget the little town, De Pere.
yeah,
Uh, and I go in and I start talking to this guy Tim, and I'm like, oh, I just got started fly fishing, and I live in the UP, and what flies should I buy? The stuff you do when you're just getting started. And I remember he told me, he said, we're getting started. And he said, we're really excited. We're starting to run drift boats just like out west. And we're running them for smallmouth bass. And we really think this is going to be a big, big deal. And I remember thinking, nah, you got to trout fish. I thought that's what fly fishing is all about, trout fishing. But man, I have watched where he went from that day forward, and it's incredible. And you wrote the book on smallmouth with him and the crew, right?
yeah.
How'd that
Well,
come about? Yeah.
Well, I too found myself at Tight Lines Fly Shop just like you. And actually, the very first book, very first essay in the book is called Kidney Country.
Yeah.
And, Tight Lines is the fly shop I go to. Kind of,
Uh-huh.
that's where I bought my first big boy fly rod. Um, so Tim has introduced so many people to the sport, and he was a kind of a early person on YouTube as well. So he's just been an educator and a spreader of the word and the joy of the sport for a long
Yeah.
time. And I think I first heard about tight lines because of an article by Tim Davis in Gray Sporting Journal about fishing with them, and I thought, wow. I mean, at this time in my life, I was, in my mid 20s. I'd done a ton of smallmouth fishing. I think at that time it was like my fish, right? But I was always fishing it with spinning gear, um, and so like, wow, how cool that I can catch this fish on a fly rod. And I'll say it, I don't feel any disadvantage. I mean, I fish with a lot of spinning anglers for smallmouth. I love smallmouth bass on the fly rod, and smallmouth bass love the fly. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot that you can do with the fly rod because there are times when you have to fish slow. There are times when you have to fish quiet. So I love the fly rod as a tool for fishing smallmouth bass. And how did that book came about? I started going to tight lines, and I started spending a couple months a year in that general area fishing trout and smallmouth. So I became a little bit of a shop rat. I was always there, and we started kicking the can around on on bass fishing, um, and I don't know the exact moment where we thought, "Hey, smallmouth bass book," but it kind of naturally evolved out of
Yeah.
conversations we were having, and I think the that book has done really well. I think, geez, I checked on Amazon. I'm like, holy smokes, there's a lot of reviews on this thing. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm really happy that that book has been useful for people. One of the things I tried to do with that book was definitely kind of equip people with the forensic tools so they can go and parse their own water.
Hmm.
Because, as different regions fish differently, different river systems fish differently.
Right.
Um, and there's no one size fits all. So I wanted to kind of take that approach and, by thinking of, these 10 elements, you can go and kind of, you know, better understand your water, your home water, or any water. So, yeah, I love that part of Wisconsin. Grew up fishing, grew up fishing there with bait and spin casting tackle. Then moved on to the fly fishing stuff, and so much opportunity there: trout, bass, muskie, pike, you name it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I want to talk a little. I want to talk a little more about your book. Ultimately, if you do it for us, love you to read a little bit for us. But I want to ask you, and again, I love to get people that think a lot and teach about writing. When I talked to Steve Duda,
Hmm.
I had him talk about his rules for fishing writing.
Ooh.
What he, as an editor, what he, there are three things that you can't do in his stories. Do you have some rules that, like, just cut dried rules that, that maybe could be connected to it? What are the biggest mistakes? So if someone's like, "Hey, I got a good story. I want to tell my story. I know a lot about fishing." What are the kind of mistakes they should be looking for when they put something together?
Yeah. Well, so cool that you asked that question of Steve. I mean, phenomenal editor, and he was kind enough to write a blurb for the
Yeah.
book, and he really shepherded a couple of the pieces from the book into a much finer existence. So I really learned how to title pieces from
Ah.
Steve Duda, and actually something. And thank you so much, Steve. Something that he taught me that I now teach to my students is to look for your title in your piece. Like, it's there, it's living there. It's maybe a word, it's maybe a phrase, maybe it needs to be kind of, gently massaged, but your title is there. And I learned that he didn't even like teach me that explicitly, but I would send him an essay with a bad title, and then all of a sudden he'd have this incredible title, but it was a word or a phrase from the essay. And he did that a couple of times, and then I finally kind of got it. Like, oh wow, they're living there. So
I
he,
can't tell you by how much I love to hear you say this. I,
yeah.
of course, people will be the judge of, but I put a lot of thought into titles, and
Hmm.
I'm really disappointed. Yeah, it's clear that you do, and I'm so disappointed if I read a book and the titles are just a little more than chapter three. It's,
Yeah, right, yeah,
I think the title, in a sense, it's kind of like the title of a song. It's yeah, yeah. So that's great.
yeah. A title's
I
like the
agree
business
completely.
card for the story, or the business card
Yeah,
for the book.
yeah.
But wow, so Steve has this wonderful bird's eye view, because as an editor he reads so much fishing writing, right, as it's coming down the pipeline. But if I were to come up with rules for fishing writing, what shouldn't it do? Or maybe what should it do? So I'm gonna,
Yeah.
okay, nothing's popping into the head right now. I would say that you know it should locate the reader in a sensory space. Like, there should be some like smell or touch or taste or sound
Mhm.
to kind of ground the reader. And then I guess try to avoid cliches. But yeah, you're gonna ask Steve a second time, because he's gonna have a better answer on that. um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think cliches. It's and they're hard. They're hard because sometimes you might not even think you're using a cliche because it's a throwaway, but that's
yeah.
one of the reasons it shouldn't be there. But when people use them and think they're making an original point, it's uh,
Yeah, yeah, but
and
no, it's a
it,
great question, and like I'm gonna think of a better answer for you.
okay,
Maybe
sure,
it'll pop into
sure,
my head during this conversation, or maybe it'll pop in
yeah,
later in.
yeah. So
Yes, the
so
don'ts of fishing writing. That could be a book. Get Steve
yeah,
Duda, and Greg Thomas and Tom Pye, and get them all together in a room um, for one day, and just crank that book out. The don'ts of fishing writing.
the don't fish of fishing writing, yeah. Um, uh, so your book coming out in a couple weeks, few weeks,
Yeah, I think
middle of
October,
October.
October 15th, and you know
Yeah,
how it is as a writer, Tim, you're
yeah,
tasting the soup for like a year, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah,
and now, the author's copies finally came out. So, you feel like it's been out for a while, but it hasn't, right? So it hits
yeah.
the shelves October 15th. And if you've already ordered, that's when I will be receiving my, customer copies, right? So I just have, a couple of these right now. But yeah, so out on the 15th. Look for them wherever fine fishing books are sold. I'm
Yeah.
also selling signed copies through Midcurrent. So if you go to midcurrent.com, you go to their shop, you will find signed copies at the same price and the same shipping as Amazon for
Yeah.
now.
And these are essays. Has everything appeared somewhere, or is there some new
Yeah, there
material?
are there a number of the pieces have changed a good deal. So some are very new looking, and there is a new piece that anchors the collection.
Hmm.
The new piece is, I think it's the longest piece um, in the book. It's about a trip my wife and I took to Long Island bone fishing,
Yeah.
and it was, a really cool trip. And you know, at the time she was pregnant. She was 6 months pregnant with our daughter. And when I wrote the essay, our daughter was born, and she became, the big thing in both our lives. So it was a really unique experience to, write this essay, which is really, in a way, an essay about, a family essay about a family changing, and being at you know, this point in evolution, um, while in the Bahamas.
Hmm. Uh-huh. So spans about 20 years, your stories.
Yeah, spans about 20 years. Yeah, so from peeking in the window at Tightline's Fly Shop,
Yeah.
to looking in the mirror of the Airbnb in the Bahamas. I'd say, let's see, 25, 15, about 15,
15,
20
15.
to now. But yeah, so the 15 years of fishing. And a lot of stuff, when I was putting the book together, a lot of stuff didn't make the cut, right?
Yeah.
So that was an interesting process, because that story that you mentioned, the Traver one, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
okay, now I'm gonna put the Traver one in. I'm like, it doesn't fit there. I'm like, oh. So that was a piece that didn't make it in the book,
Yeah.
just like didn't really have a place. I mean, it was a Hex story, but I like the other Hex essay better. And so there were a lot of, I have a little like room of kind of disgruntled essays right now, wondering why they didn't get into the book. So
Yeah.
at some point, I'm going to have to, you know, do
Another
something with
book.
that.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Couldn't call it B-sides, and they're not B-sides, but yeah, a book has to have an arc, a gestalt. Things need to fit together. It can't be redundant. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So a couple pieces didn't make it. Um, yeah. There were some other Muskie stories that just didn't quite get in there. So maybe there'll be a Muskie book one day.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully written.
Well, thanks. I
Wonderful.
mean,
Great, great stories with people, with places, wonderful places. I just, everyone's going to love it. And I'm excited to get it. And I'm excited for them to get a chance to read it. What do you have for us? Can you read a little bit? Just,
for sure. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Share something with us.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Well, we're talking about that hex stuff, right?
Yeah.
So maybe I'll. Oh, I had the pen marking the bookmark, but then I knocked the pen out. Okay, here we go. And the two books were hobnobbing just moments ago. I heard them whispering in the background. I don't know if your podcast caught all of that, but they look really good together. So um, okay, so this is called Hex Upon Me. And this was written about. Yeah, I bought a trout camp in northern Michigan. And, I bought a trout camp before I owned anything. So I was renting in Ann Arbor, and I was like, well, one, I don't have enough money to buy anything here. Two, I really don't want to own anything here. What I really want is a trout camp. So it's a story about kind of a dubious, life plan to buy a trout camp before you buy your first home. So I'll give it a quick read. Oh, the first little section. I haven't hexed in 5 years. Last fall, I started mumbling this compulsively, like the ancient mariner who tells his tale to one in three, to anyone in my vicinity. I told my barber, my colleagues, my students, the latter of whom exchanged knowing glances with each other, their suspicions of madness finally confirmed. While it's anyone's guess how non anglers understood my moaning, bewailing a hiatus from Doublecraft, My fishing friends appreciated the depth and direness of the situation. To the Midwestern trout angler, the mayfly known as Hexagenia limbata is the universe's one clear compensation for our missing mountains, our absent ocean, the danger of moving through life knowing that one day you may be called upon to drive through Indiana. To miss the winged redeemer 5 years in a row points to an existential crisis that asks, what, O angler, are you doing with your life? Apologies to the Hoosiers, I'm a Hoosier by birth. No harm meant. The problem was that every year I seemed to get an irresistible assignment that coincided with hex time. There was the June I spent surrounded by thousands of puckering grayling in a Polish mountain valley smeared with wildflowers. The June I spent in Alaska swinging tiny headwater tributaries for untiny king salmon. The June I spent hammered by black flies while hammering brook trout and Wananiche in Labrador. But no matter how good the day at each one of these far-flung destinations had been, when I went to bed each night, I was haunted by what I was missing back home in Michigan. Giant, demon-eyed trout with spots as big as your fist. Moonlit mudflats that went from calm to bubbling in the blink of an eye. The baritone thunk of a big trout rising in the dark, so resonant you could feel it in your chest, like a grouse's wingbeat. Next year I fish hex, I would whisper to myself in the darkness after the camp generator was killed, or the northern lights glittered forth above a horizon of spruce. But then winter would come again, some exotic opportunity would drift into view, and like a spring brook trout, I'd rise to it. Then one year I snapped. No more, I declared. And just to show the universe how serious I was, I bought a trout camp. It wasn't fancy and it wasn't huge, just a few acres at the end of a Michigan 2-track, undeveloped except for a rotted out 60s camper and two equally ancient picnic tables, their benches bowed like the tusks of a bull elephant. Across the south end of the property ran a small creek, and while it was too small and cold to support the great burrowing mayfly, it did flow into the mainstream of a bigger river just half a mile away. And what a stretch that was. There, the big river took on a different character compared to the 50 or so miles of water above it. The cobble petered out to sand as the water widened and deepened, and pine forests yielded to black dirt farmland. Total numbers of trout decreased while the average size ballooned, and locals spoke of the occasional walleye and pike. In short, it was 20 river miles of the most perfect hex water you could imagine, even if you were a professional dreamer with many empty hours to spare. In other words, a fishing writer. Yeah, so I like that piece because,
That's
um, in terms of Hemingway's sentence, right? The true sentence. So for me, that was a very true paragraph. I was doing a lot of traveling, and it stopped. I really missed the Midwest. I missed, White Pine. I really missed fishing northern Michigan. So this was kind of like a little, little homage to that, and it was, yeah, pretty cool. So get to fish there quite a bit now, and it's really fun just having home water that you're really into, and get a lot of chance to fish that. So
well, it's beautiful, and there's plenty more of that in your book.
yeah,
It's a wonderful book, and I don't think people say this often enough to writers, but thank you for writing it.
oh, and Tim, thank you for writing yours. I mean, I'm a huge fan, and I love every page of A Castaway as well. So
Well,
it means
thank
a
you.
lot coming from you.
Yeah. I could talk to you forever, but I know you have a little child that you probably got to get
I have a
going home
rugrat
for
who
soon.
is probably wondering if Dada's going to walk through the door with a donut as he does every
Yeah.
day.
Okay.
So
Yeah. So we'll
I'll have
have to
to, I'll have to
get
get
you
a.
there. But I would love to keep talking to you. Maybe we'll do it. You'll teach me how to use your musky net one day, maybe.
You know what? That sounds like a deal.
All right.
I will. I'll get some WD-40. I'll knock the rust off, and let's
Yeah.
trade off. Let's trade off muskies. How
I
about
would
that?
love to do that. Well, thank you, Dave, so much for taking the time to talk with us and tell us about your whole story, your book, and you already said where people can get the book.
Yeah,
Um,
anywhere you like, but midcurrent.com's got signed copies. So, and the joke I tell people is that when each book goes out the door from my house, it gets a little incantation. that inures all readers against skunks. So you'll never be skunked again, actually, if you buy from Midcurrent.
And you don't charge extra for that.
You know what? That is gratis. Yeah. So
Oh,
Amazon can't make the no skunk guarantee.
well, there you go. There you go. Well, thank you so much, Dave. And
Thank you,
again,
Tim.
I appreciate you being here.
Yeah. I'll see you on the water soon, hopefully.
You bet.
Okay. Take
Oh,
care.
you're gonna feel it, know that you